Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second talk in the 2022 conference for the Network for Research on Morality. I'm delighted that Maria Silvia Vaccarezza has agreed to talk to us. She's recently written a wonderful book on practical wisdom, or edited a wonderful book on practical wisdom. And so she's going to talk to us some about her views on that today. She is an associate professor of moral philosophy at the University of Geneva and a secretary of the Center on Virtues, or Aristotelian. She's the author of several monographs, journal articles, and book chapters. And her topics include Iris Murdoch, Aristotle's Ethics, phronesis, of course, the unity of the virtues, moral exemplarity. And the book that she recently edited is Practical Wisdom, Philosophical and Psychological Perspectives. And that's with Maria de Caro. And she also co-edited a book called Virtues, Democracy, and Online Media, Ethical and Epistemic Issues with Nancy Snow. So Maria has accomplished a lot. She looks young, but she's already accomplished a lot. So we're delighted to have you today and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Many thanks, Blaine, and many thanks, everybody, especially for the looks young part. It's only obviously appearance, but still I'm happy that you think so. So I'm really glad to be here to share my thoughts on practical wisdom, and I'm even happier. Sorry, I hear a background noise. I don't think it's me, but whatever, doesn't matter. So I'm even happier because there's someone attending whom I'll mention quite a lot and whose views I'll discuss, so that's even better. So what am I gonna do in this talk? I'm gonna, if it works, check. Okay, first of all, I'll explain what I mean by eliminativism or practical wisdom eliminativism, and I'll present mostly two eliminativist views, very recent ones, as you'll see. Then I'll defend an account of practical wisdom as ethical expertise. And then finally, I'll show how I think this account can help overturning the eliminativistic charges and add a few words on other consequences of my account, but very briefly and tentatively. And this is, I'd love to discuss about all this stuff, but especially the tentative stuff at the end of the talk. So let's get started. First of all, what I mean with eliminativism, it's basically the label I assign to two views, one by Christian Miller, who's here, hi Christian, and the other from Dan Lapsley, both in this 2021 edited volume I had the pleasure and honor to edit with my colleague Maria de Caro on practical wisdom. What I get from Miller's and Lapsley's chapters is that practical wisdom should be considered either as an implausible construct or as a redundant philosophical concept, and I'll show you why in a minute. So let's start with Christian. In Christian Miller's chapter, there's a very useful and interesting recognition of the several functions assigned to practical wisdom by the literature, let's say, the most well-established neo-Aristotelian scholars. And part of the reason why Miller is skeptical about practical wisdom is that they are really too many, according to his view. Let's check these functions. There's 7 he identifies in the literature. The first one is the end setting function. So practical wisdom is taken as having an end setting function, meaning that the examples are mine. Christian has more precise definitions of each function, but in order to be clear, I've chosen to give an example of what is meant by the function rather than explaining the function itself. So according to the end setting function, practical wisdom is responsible for me knowing that For example, generosity is a virtuous end, or helping out people is a virtuous end. Then we have the end specification function, which means that I do not only know that generosity is a virtuous end in general, but I know more particularly that, for example, generosity requires me to help out people where and when I can. So I can see what is generosity in a situation or in slightly more detail, rather than only knowing the very general thing. Then we have an instrumental function, for example, that in order to help out, so to be generous, I should do X, Y, and Z. So I can find the means towards the end of being generous. Fourth, a justification function, which means that I know I have a reason R to be generous. So I'm aware of the reasons I have for considering generosity a worthwhile end, a worthwhile virtuous end. Related to this, we have the knowing reasons function, because I don't know just that I have a reason to be generous, but I also know that I have a reason to do what I need to do in order to help out, for example. So I have a reason to choose that particular action as a way to be virtuous, generous in the example. Sixth, we have a very key function assigned to practical wisdom by almost everybody working on practical wisdom within neo-Aristotelian virtue ethics, the handling conflicts function, which means that I know, for example, how to balance generosity and justice, let's say, in this particular case, for example, when I'm grading exams. So I know that in order to be generous, I need to take into account requirements posed by other domains or other virtues, for example. And this is the work, the peculiar work of practical wisdom or phronesis. I will use the terms as synonyms throughout the talk. So, and finally, we have the perception function. So it's due to practical wisdom if, as I should, I notice, for example, my colleagues' troubles, and I take it as a reason to act and to activate, let's say, my generosity. So I'm not just aware that I should be generous and that generosity implies helping out. I also notice, I perceive the troubles of my colleague so that I feel willing to help out. So what's the problem for Christian with these 7 functions? Well, this is the references and the examples are mine. There are 3 concerns raised by Christian, very interesting ones. First, what he calls the subsumption concern, which sounds like this. What is left of a moral virtues once the various roles of practical wisdom are factored out? So it seems that practical wisdom does all the job there is to be done. So there's no role for moral virtues left when you assign to practical wisdom all these 7 functions. Second one relates to a certain arbitrary or stipulative, let's say, character of the functions just listed. So why are we to ascribe these functions and not others, for example, to practical wisdom, or in a way that the list is not simply ad hoc? So it's just that Aristotle told us that phronesis comprises these functions, or is there any good reason why we should think it plays so many of these functions? And then we have the unity concern, because the problem here would be that how can we really think that one single character trait is capable of performing so diverse functions as the 7 you've seen, some related to deliberating, some others to being motivated to act upon that deliberation, some others to holding good reasons and being able to articulate those reasons. So how many things so diverse how can they be ascribed to the very same single character trait? So that leads Christian Miller to the, eliminativist conclusion, which sounds like this: we should simply reject the appeal to one intellectual virtue, practical wisdom, which is supposed to carry out some or all of the functions associated with practical wisdom. Instead, for each function, we should appeal to a distinct character trait that corresponds to that function. So we should get rid of practical wisdom, basically. The second eliminativist contributor to that book, Dan Lapsley, locates the problem of practical wisdom in the sphere of translation of this philosophical concept into psychological constructs. I won't read it all, but the problem is that, yes, we can translate the various functions of practical wisdom or phronesis into robust psychological constructs, but the problem is that translating is dangerous, because then once there's many problems related to translation, as you can see from the omissis, let's say, but the central problem is this one, that once you've translated this philosophical concept and you've factored it out in terms of psychological constructs, the point is that there's, according to Lapsley, it's not at all clear what value added, and I'm quoting here, explanatory role the very philosophical concept plays. So the conclusion drawn by Lapsley is not called eliminativist or eliminativistic, but you can see that in a way it is. And here I'm reading the quotation: I want to suggest the possibility that the role of phronesis in Aristotelian virtue ethics is much like the role of, ether or ether, I'm not very familiar with the English word, in physics, once thought crucial, but now expendable. Okay. Yeah. In which case, the use of the phronetic lexicon becomes optional, superfluous, or distracting, or a form of special plating. Okay. So we are left with a quite quite strong and straightforward rejection of practical wisdom here. So the problem with Lapsley's concerns about translation is this, that he seems to imply that if we can translate phronesis into psychological variables, it is redundant, plays no value-added explanatory role. But of course, the other way around, the option in which phronesis would not be translatable into psychological variables makes phronesis implausible. So if you don't find anything that correlates with the functions or the general idea of practical wisdom, then you're left with a philosophical concept with no credibility, let's say, or empirical plausibility. So what are we supposed to do? There's many ways to argue against eliminativism, and Blaine and Kristjánsson, who are both here, have done a great job in working on a very credible account of practical wisdom and its functions in two very recent papers. One has just come out by Christian. I haven't downloaded yet, but I've read the 2022 co-authored paper by Blaine and Christian. So there's many counterattacks, let's say, to eliminativism, but I will focus, quite obviously, on my own route, which I've developed together with my colleague Mario De Caro, would be to conceive of practical wisdom as ethical expertise. So I will present why and how I defend this view of phronesis or practical wisdom as ethical expertise. And then I will show that if this picture is credible, we have some ways to rebut eliminativism as well, in the form of Kristen Miller's and then Lapsley's chapters. Of course, not any possible eliminativism, but these specific challenges. So we have already defended and developed our thesis in several works where we advanced the idea that phronesis should be conceived and translated as ethical expertise. So my point today will be to move forward along the path and show, as I said, that this can help, that can be one of the ways of efficiently, let's say, effectively rebutting eliminativism. And as I will suggest, possibly even overturning the charge. So in our first works, we found support in several places in literature and empirical and philosophical literature. For example, in Dreyfus' idea of the wise. Here we take it, the practically wise, to be kind of the phronesis, to be overlapping with what we mean by the practically wise in an Aristotelian sense. So the wise as the ethical expert, but also on Darshan Narvaez's work on wisdom as expertise on the conduct and meaning of life, as well as mature moral functioning. Obviously also on Schwartz and Sharp, wisdom as moral skill plus moral will. And we have to say that within the virtue ethical domain, there are many, we can feel more reluctance, let's say, to accept the idea of conceiving of practical wisdom as a form of expertise or skill, even among those who are happy to see the ethical virtues or the moral virtues as skills. For example, John Hacker Wright admits in this 2015 paper that practical wisdom can be seen as good deliberation guided by correct conception of worthwhile ends. Hence, there may be a dimension of skill involved in practical wisdom, because deliberating well is arguably a skill. But there are several concerns in translating the language of practical wisdom into the language of skills or degrees of expertise and skills involved in expertise. Especially three objections that I will discuss, because in order to restate the translation of practical wisdom as ethical expertise as a credible one, I think we have to preliminarily answer the earlier challenges against the very idea. So, well, the first two objections are related to domain and to motivation. What's the problem with domain? This is the problem Hacker Wright raises in that very paper I was quoting. The problem is that skills are domain relative, whereas practical wisdom is general. Every philosophical account of practical wisdom has it that practical wisdom should be a form of general wisdom, which orchestrates or regulates life, not just a single domain. Second problem is with motivation, because wisdom, according to many, can be seen as a decision-making skill, because you can be skillful but fail to act on your skill, whereas you can't be practically wise and fail to act, to be motivated to act on your practical wisdom. And it's not the case that if I am virtuous or wise, I choose deliberately to ignore my motivation to be wise. It may be deficient, but not voluntarily. This is something Aristotle already said when distinguishing between techne and praxis and phronesis. Sorry. And the final objection concerns the ends, because according to any standard view of practical wisdom, it requires a correct conception of worthwhile ends. This is correct, but there's Kristjánsson also claiming that unlike expert decision-making skills, wisdom requires grappling with existential questions. And Matt Stichter has a similar argument in his 2016 paper. Okay, so what's the way to make the case for practical wisdom as ethical expertise? We've relied on quite recent work by Jason Swartwood and Valerie Tiberius on expert decision-making skills, and on their attempt to conceive of practical wisdom as one of these kind of skills, and especially as the ability in the domain of all things considered decisions. This model is based both on the recognition prime decision model and on more general research on expertise. And it helps providing a framework for, let's say, trying to accomplish this translation of practical wisdom. According to the model, there are several abilities included by practical wisdom, which for the sake of honesty, I must say that they call just wisdom, but I think what they mean is exactly Aristotelian practical wisdom, and they kind of say that. So there are several abilities included by practical wisdom, some of which are derived from the RPD model, and two more added from general research on expert decision making. So there's in this kind of expertise of expert decision making skills in context of complex choice, there's an intuitive ability to expertise, which means being able to identify very quickly, effortlessly, and without deliberation what to do. There's a deliberative ability included in this kind of skill, and the metacognitive one, obviously identifying when intuition or deliberation are appropriate. But there's more to it, because as I said, from general research on expertise, they've drawn two more abilities which should be included in a good account of wisdom as this kind of expertise: the self-regulative ability and the self-cultivation ability. So the self-regulation, meaning being able to identify how to affect the environment, behavior, affect, and motivations in order to accomplish what we have identified as the action to do, and the self-cultivation, which means state or practice and experience in order to be reliably skilled, let's say, in the long run. So yeah, and this is the 2019 paper. So from this picture of wisdom as expert decision-making skill in context of complex choice, we can see how the three objections listed before can be rebutted, because, well, yes, skills normally are related to very specific domains, but this kind of skills in challenging performances, are not compartmentalized as standard, let's say, or lower order skills, and they include a wide range of abilities. The example of such skill could be, for example, the good firefighter, which is not someone who's simply good at extinguishing fires, let's say. So the model for the practically wise would be an expert in a domain of challenging performance, which implies being endowed with a wide range of abilities, not just being very good at dealing with one specific domain. The same holds for motivation, because in this kind of skills, it is required that an expert has motivating affective responses shaped through experience and reflection. Again, the firefighter, in order to be good at what he does or she does, should be motivated to deal with, for example, the dangerous situations or the situation she has to face. Or the good doctor, we might say. So motivation is part of what it is to be skilled in those kinds of situations. And the same, according to Swartwood and Tiberius, can be said of the reflection on the value of ends. In expert decision-making skills, at least some of them, maybe not all of them, but at least in some of them, and for example, the medical doctor or the fighters could be good examples, a reflection on the value of ends is an important part of what it means to be expert. So how can this model be used to rebut the challenges seen at the beginning of the paper? Well, let's start with the translation problem, let's say. Remember, we were lost in the translation problem, meaning that, we had one option. We had Dan Lapsley's option, practical wisdom. Oh, no, sorry, that was the other one. Sorry. We have the option that practical wisdom or phronesis is not translatable into psychological variables, in which case it's expandable. But to this, we can reply that this proposal of translation, as well as other proposals of translation, grant that it is not expandable. We can rely on a concept that has psychological credibility. But the problem with Lapsley was the other option, which is that if phronesis is translatable, well, its philosophical import is redundant. So it becomes a useless, redundant philosophical concept. Okay, in order to reply to this, I need a longer sentence than the previous one. How can we defend that even if we can translate phronesis into psychological variables or constructs, there's still, as Lapsley had it, a value-added explanatory role other than what is provided by psychological theory. So once we have this credible concept, what's the philosophical role, let's say, what's the reason why we are allowed to retain the very word and the very concept rather than its psychological counterpart? My very naive, if you want, answer is this, that practical wisdom is also a normative rather than just descriptive concept, which means that in the philosophical discourse, in the ethical discourse, it is used as an action guiding and action assessing concept, not just as a very useful label to describe how the virtuous person acts or thinks or deliberates, but also to prescribe how a person should think, deliberate, and act. For example, just to pick the most famous ways to use practical wisdom as a normative rather than descriptive concept, I've chosen the standard Hursthouse definition of what the right action is in terms of the practically wise. Hursthouse claims that an action is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent, meaning a phronimos, would characteristically do in the circumstances, blah, blah, blah. So here, the phronimos is used as a way to assess whether an action is right or not, and to guide choices, because in order to guide the decisions about what to do. And the other is Linda Zagzebski's. Again, an act is good in every respect when it is a virtuous, phronetic act, and is successful in bringing about the end of the virtuous motive because it is a virtuous phronetic act. So my very naive, again, conclusion here would be that here the philosophical work, which is played by practical wisdom, cannot simply be conflated with its psychological validity or adequacy. So my question to Lapsley would be why naturalizing or translating a concept should mean explaining it away. How could we account for this normative work if we simply got rid of the philosophical import of the concept just because it's translatable? Okay, but, sorry, my PowerPoint is stuck. It's really stuck. Okay, now we need to answer Christian Miller's concerns. Recall the second and the third. The second and the third were the arbitrariness concern, so that the choice of functions ascribed to practical wisdom is somehow ad hoc, and the unity. Why should we be justified to ascribe all of these diverse functions to a single character trait? Well, I think that the model that I presented, I mean, it's not, as I said, it's not the only way to show that these functions can be realistically, let's say, carried out by a single character trait, but I think it is a way to show that it is possible to assign multiple functions, so many diverse multiple functions, to a single trait, or in this case, ability, which means ethical expertise in the case at stake, but it could be another concept or construct or trait in other accounts. But in particular, I think we could, even if I'm not that sure we are really, I'm really sure about that, but this slide, this translation, but I think we could translate the 7 functions that Christian identifies in his paper into the abilities included by the model presented of practical wisdom as ethical expertise. For example, I think the end-setting function, knowing that generosity is a good end, could be played by the deliberative and self-cultivation ability included by expertise. Again, the end specification could be carried out by the intuitive and deliberative, and so on. I don't want to bother you with all this table of translations, but again, the justification to me is clearly part of what it takes to have a deliberative ability. And also the metacognitive component is involved in the knowing reasons functions, as far as I can see. Whereas the self-regulative is more involved in the handling, as far as I can see, in the handling conflicts and in the perception, where there's the intuitive, the strong intuitive component, but also self-regulative. So I think the ascription of so diverse functions is feasible and realistic. It may not be the right way of translating these functions, but still I see a possibility to do that. What's my main point here is, though, the first of Christian Miller's concerns, the subsumption, which was, you remember, what is left of a moral virtue once the various roles of practical wisdom are factored out. So as those who know my work can imagine, my answer is that I'm very happy to bite the bullet. Nothing is left of the moral virtue, strictly speaking, meaning that practical wisdom is, in fact, necessary and sufficient for being virtuous. So when Christian says that there does not seem to be anything else to having a moral virtue besides just having practical wisdom, I couldn't agree more. Of course, I'm not saying that it's not useful to keep on talking about the virtues, or that we should get rid of virtue language at all. But what I mean to suggest is that we should refrain from granting them some kind of ontological or even psychological independence, as if they were a collection of independent traits plus practical wisdom managing them, let's say. And in in saying this, my colleague Mario and I were first drawn to this idea by rereading Plato's Protagoras, where Plato has it that when you label someone as, for example, courageous, what you're meaning is that courage is the name of that person's wisdom in that domain. So our reply would be to Christian's first concern will be, yes, we accept that, we bite the bullet and we buy into virtue eliminativism rather than his wisdom eliminativism. And we draw a quite similar conclusion, because in the conclusion of his paper, Christian Miller claims that, yes, we can retain phronesis or practical wisdom as a useful label. And this is exactly what we think we should do with the names of the virtues. So we oppose our virtues as useful labels view to Christian Miller's practical wisdom as a useful label view, so to speak. We're aware that this could be seen as a kind of paradigm shift, because we basically propose to move from a picture where you have practical wisdom at the core of one's moral life and the separate, single separate ethical virtues in some way revolving around practical wisdom, but still independent from it, to a paradigm where basically practical wisdom is all there is to virtue, and it expresses itself in virtuous ways, meaning that, for example, where you're wise in the domain of handling fear, for example, you're labeled as courageous, but you're behaving courageously. But what's going on really is that you're being wise in the field of handling fear, for example. And the same will hold for the other virtues. When you're behaving wisely in the field of pleasures, you are called temperate or temperate. So I think I've only 5 minutes, so I'm not going to deal at length with the arguments for thinking that this paradigm shift, which is somehow a consequence of the rebuttal of eliminativism, for this paradigm shift to be also useful to avoid other contradictions or problems in the standard paradigm in this one, in the first half of the screen. So I'll just say that standard versions, so that the first half of the screen has problems, according to me, has problems which are difficult to solve if we keep on thinking of this kind of dualism between practical wisdom on the one hand and the ethical virtues on the other hand, and also thinking of the single ethical virtues as independent from one another. So just very, very briefly, one concern is about fragmentation. For example, it's much more difficult to think of practical wisdom as being capable of orchestrating independent traits, already formed traits, if you think of them as fragmented rather than springing from the same source, let's say. The second is what I call the appearance concern, which means that in standard account, it would seem that at some point of the educational training, of the moral educational training, practical wisdom appears. So you first have to train every virtue, for example, become generous by giving things to other people for a long time. And then at some point you become wise. That's practical wisdom that at some point of the educational path appears. But the traits were pre-existing, so to speak. And what's the training of practical wisdom in between? What does it mean that at some point it comes up after having trained other traits for a long time? And finally, I have the integration concern. So how do we balance the fact that we know that the ethical virtues should be integrated and orchestrated, let's say, in order to be proper virtues and not simple blind tendency to repeat standard actions, with the experience, how do we balance that with the experience that there's people who fare better in some domains than in others, and we don't really want to downgrade their virtues just because they lack other virtues. This is the classical problem in Aristotelianism, and in Aristotelianism itself, the reciprocity or unity of the virtues problem. So I just wanted to highlight that there's problems in retaining the standard view as well. So the virtue eliminativist conclusion, besides rebutting practical wisdom eliminativism, could help solving some of the pre-existing issues with standard versions of Neo-Aristotelianism. So I had very nice examples concerning, for example, being afraid of giving a talk to psychologists much more than being afraid of diving into deep sea, but I'm running out of time, so I won't make them. But if you really want, in the Q&A, I will explain you why. But yeah, and my conclusion was showing you the deep sea where I'm not afraid at diving. Okay, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that talk, Maria Silvia. That gives us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure people are going to have many reactions and questions for you. But it's great to get us started in this discussion and to outline some of the really key issues. And I think, you know, working closely with critics of practical wisdom is a great way to bring out some of these points in a very good scholarly direction. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
What we'll want to do, well, before I talk about our discussion, let me once again remind you we have another talk next week, and that's going to be also at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time, and then one the week after. So please tune into those two if you can. Matt Stichter, who's here, is going to speak with us, and Tobias Kretnauer is also going to give a talk. So we've got two more great talks. So for today, though, we now have about 45 minutes set aside for discussion with Maria Silvia because she was so good at staying within the time limits. Why don't you raise your hands the way you are, and I'll just call on you in order, and we'll just work our way through the questions and answers. So Veronica, you look like you're the first.
Thank you so much for a great and thought-provoking talk. You made my brain go down about 5 different avenues, but I'm only going to stick to one of them. And that is this idea, this issue or the problem of unity with practical wisdom. I would argue that it's actually not a problem, that it is a package of traits. I wouldn't argue that, you know, I wouldn't try to sort of shoehorn it into the concept of a single trait. It's not. You know, when we talk of somebody as having practical wisdom, what we're visualizing is somebody who's got the whole package. And another thing that I would say, sort of, you know, in terms of the argument of, gosh, I don't know quite how to word it, but basically, as you were speaking, I had written down, you know, the different functions of practical wisdom that you cited, and I was trying to imagine practical wisdom without one of them, you know, so practical wisdom without the ability to notice when it's appropriate to act, or, you know, without the ability to handle conflicts between goals, or without the ability to actually know how to translate your, you know, your desire to act virtuously into specific behaviors. And I couldn't do it, right? In other words, somebody has practical wisdom if they have the whole package, if they have all of, and that is something I think that can be empirically tested. You know, you can measure each of those pieces of the puzzle separately and then see whether, I don't know quite what the sort of criterion would be, but then see whether that person is described perhaps by others as mature, only if they score high on all of those pieces. So I guess there's a couple of things I'm trying to say. One is that maybe we shouldn't be trying to use the word trait at all. This is one of those rare concepts that actually falls in a different category. It's a package concept. And I don't think we should be apologetic about that. So that's one thing I want to say. And the other is that I do think that this is translatable and amenable into, psychological, sort of empirical psychological domain. But you would have to assess the pieces, and it would be a very interesting empirical question. Do all the pieces need to be there for somebody to really qualify as having practical wisdom?
Wow. Well, many thanks for this. Really reassuring and also helpful. That, I like very much this idea of avoiding the usage of trait and the idea of a package concept. Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Maria, Silvia, could I ask you to stop sharing? That way we can see.
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah. Here it is.
Thank you. Cynthia, you had or Cindy, I guess, really is what we say, right?
Either is fine. Yeah, I had a question as I was listening, and maybe this is my lack of knowledge about practical wisdom, but as I was listening to your description of all the characteristics of practical wisdom, it got me wondering what the difference is between practical wisdom and any other kind of expertise. Because I felt like a lot of the things that you were saying, and I was trying to find an example of a good surgeon, for example, or a good comedian, or a good instructor who doesn't have the practical wisdom piece just applied in a specific domain.
Mm-hmm.
So, so at the end where you have practical wisdom and it goes off into all the virtues, like, yeah, I get that, but why can't that also go off into professor or librarian or driver?
Okay, I see. Yeah, well, okay. I'd say, as far as I can see, or the idea would be, practical wisdom would be the kind of expertise, as Swartwood and Tiberius put it, in all things considered decisions, which means that, you can be a very good surgeon, so you have that very complex expertise, but when you're acting like a person and not specifically in your role as a surgeon, for example, if you're practically wise or ethically expert, you're good at making decisions that question, for example, your being a surgeon. So a higher level kind of issues, which doesn't imply that kind of expertise replaces or makes useless the expertise you have as a surgeon, but that in the domain of choices, all things considered choices, which means also choices involving, I don't know, how many hours should I work as a surgeon rather than spending time with my family, for example. In that case, your expertise as a surgeon is not enough. Let's say it's not enough to balance values at stake here. And that's where you can see if you're wise in that kind of way. I should see it as this kind of expertise in terms of choices where no particular role is at stake apart from the role of being human and an agent.
Mm-hmm. But then some of it does come into play within professions, because you brought up the example with grading papers, for example.
Yeah.
And definitely a good instructor is going to be someone who is both just and kind. And can balance those two things. So, I mean, I don't necessarily see it as a problem necessarily, but I see it more as like, is this perhaps the virtue that makes all expertise possible?
My instinctive and intuitive answer would be yes, but yesterday I was arguing against a colleague who was claiming that in order to be a good musician, a good performer, you need to be virtuous. And I thought that that's too much. That's counterintuitive, you know. In order to perform well, you need so many abilities also related to morality that there's no other way than being overall virtuous. So I don't have a real answer to your question, I must say. I need to think about that. My intuition would be that, yes, you need some degree at least of general expertise in order to be a good teacher, for example. Maybe not in order to be a good surgeon. I'm not sure about that. I'm not a surgeon. I'm a teacher, so maybe I'm more familiar with that. But yeah, I'm not sure how far we can go in requiring for it's a great question. I should think about that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. The order as I have it is Matt next, then Monica, then Christian. And given that Christian has been mentioned many times, we definitely want to include him in the conversation. So Matt, what question do you have for Maria Silvia?
Thanks for the talk. Of course, I'm sympathetic to all of this. Just one minor point, I guess, and then one more challenging question. One, you just might note that the recognition prime decision making's a pretty narrow understanding of expertise. It doesn't really account for flexibility and control, both from the fact that experts frequently are not running into situations that exactly match previous patterns. And even if you had a sort of an associated, here's this situation, here's what I do in response, that assumes your goals are the same when you're entering a situation. So when you enter into a different same situation, but with different goals, you're going to want to have different patterns of response, not that you're just going to get a knee-jerk reaction. So Ellen Fredlund and I wrote an article on an expert account of expertise, and we cover some of that there. But so, I think it's fine, but it's just only a partial grasp of the expertise literature. So I just caution not limiting to that. And then the worry I have about the where you're comfortable with basically there's just practical wisdom. There's no need for the virtues. I've had these worries when, like, Annis argues that virtue is just like the skill of living, and it's just this one skill in sort of living your life well. I feel the same sort of worry accrues here when you just shift the focus and say, no, it's just one thing of practical wisdom, which is just, it breaks down the skill and expertise model, because skills require feedback mechanisms. And you need to get, sort of reliable feedback of, very specific targets, so that you can get feedback, so that you can do deliberate practice sessions, so you know exactly what it is you're sort of getting wrong and so forth. And so when you go from the very, high abstract level of living a flourishing life, or, and what virtue's aiming at, there's a large level between that and how you're thinking about how you're acting on a day-to-day basis, and whether those actions are contributing to your overall goal of flourishing. Like, the worry is the feedback mechanism is just, there has to be intermediate. Elsewhere, like in my book, I argue, I think the virtues is playing an intermediate role, essentially, because it'd just be too hard to get direct feedback just on the basis of your sort of most abstract goal of flourishing. So it may be a reason why you might not want to go the false assumption route, but something to consider.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'll need to navigate more literature and expertise, and so thanks for the hint. What I liked about Swartwood and Tiberius model is that they were not simply confined to the RPD. They realize there's limits to it, and they tend to, or try to, integrate that with other other stuff, which I like better than simply using that model, and that's it. But yeah, I'll definitely go through more papers, more work on that. But I was very interested on the issue of the skill of living well as a super general and going down to real life, day-to-day interactions with the reality, where you need feedback mechanism and so on. Yes. Just as a way to react immediately to your consideration, I wouldn't see flourishing as this very abstract. I mean, I agree with you. I realize there's a problem here. What I just wouldn't want to see to claim is that practical wisdom is the skill needed in order to flourish in general, as to aim to eudaimonia, let's say, in a very abstract and general way. I would see it more as a flourishing, an embodied flourishing, let's say. So meaning trying to live well here and now, not simply having a sketch of the good life in mind and being skillful at pursuing that sketch in day-to-day life. I don't know if you see what I mean. I would put flourishing more down to earth. I'm not saying that this solves the problem. I can see the problem you raise, and it's very useful for me to think of it. But yeah, I would just like to think of flourishing as a less, background concept and a more concrete and down to earth concept, as how can I live well here? How can I behave well? Where this well has a background conception in support, but it's not that I'm trying to pursue that background whenever I act. You know what I mean? I'm not sure.
Very interesting tension there between the abstractness of the flourishing life and the day-to-day activity. I really like that way of thinking about it as a tension and as a relationship there. So Monica, you had some thoughts?
Yes, thank you very much for this presentation. I mean, really, lots of things that come to mind. And so I just want to get on a couple of things. And one was what Veronica was saying. I actually agree with this. That wisdom is not one trait, but it is really multifaceted. And as you see in the literature, how people have tried to assess wisdom, they always assess it with several components. There is not one component, there are several components. And then exactly how you do it is, a wise person would be somebody who scores really high on all of these components, not just one or two, but on all of these components. Like my three-dimensional wisdom model, right? That is the cognitive and reflective and compassionate component. So you wouldn't call somebody who's only high on cognitive wise, but they also have to score high on cognitive, reflective, and compassion particularly, which I think is often ignored in some wisdom models. The other thing, what I want to say is, I really agree with you in some regards that a wise person cannot help but act virtuously. So in this regard, they can't help it because they know that this is the right way of doing it. And if they don't do it, they actually, they harm themselves. And why would they do this, right? So I completely agree with you. But on the other hand, I wouldn't get rid of the virtues either, because I think that you can be virtuous without being wise, you know, so it's the other way round. I think there are people who are quite virtuous but not necessarily wise, because I think wisdom requires this added component, you know, this insight, this understanding, that the relationship between all these kind of things. So therefore I wouldn't give it up. I wouldn't give up. But of course, the other thing, and I've thought about this too, the other thing is, however, I also think that being virtuous actually contributes to the development of wisdom. So if somebody is not virtuous, I think they cannot actually become wise. They might become smart and clever and all of these things, but they cannot become wise. So I've actually looked a very short longitudinal study just with students, and yes, there is a crossover relationship from the beginning to the end of the semester, but mostly it's from wisdom toward virtues. But gratitude, and you gave the example of gratitude, actually has this bidirectional relationship. So anyway, so yeah, lots of interesting ideas here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I didn't mention the measures, but yeah, obviously it's part of why I think it's translatable is also that there's so many reliable ways to assess components of practical wisdom. Yeah, I see why you wouldn't get rid of the virtues, and yeah, I'm. It's fun because it seems that I want to get rid of the virtues, which sounds awkward, but yeah, the point would be, yeah, I'm interested to your point on you could be virtuous without being wise. That's exactly what I wonder. I mean, if you think of the functions, let's stick with the 7 functions that Christian has identified for us. If you think of someone who lacks all of these 7 functions, I mean, my intuition wouldn't be that this person is virtuous. I'm not sure how I would call them, but I would think that there's something really important missing for them to be virtuous. I could think they're being well trained or well bred, I don't know, or that they're let's say out of temperament, they're naturally disposed to do good things, but somehow in a kind of accidental way, because if they lacked, for example, having a conception, at least a sketchy, I'm not saying that they must be able to articulate all the theoretical reasons why they think this is a good life, but at least a sketchy conception of virtuous ends, and at least some kind of deliberative ability. I mean, would you still call this person really virtuous in the proper sense of the word? I mean, I wonder.
Well,
I wouldn't.
I'm thinking about religion, right? I mean, all of the religious, you know, basically denominations will say you have to be virtuous, you know, you have to do this, this, and this. So somebody could just follow this, but then not necessarily go the next step to really understand why. Why am I doing this? Well, I want to end up in heaven, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from, you know, that you can be, you know, as a first step, you can be virtuous, but not really understand how it actually contributes to eudaimonia, for example.
Yeah. No, okay, I see that. Yeah. What would I say is that part of what it means to be fully virtuous is being in our way to develop also those kind of, I mean, as an adult, as a grown-up, I would say that part of what it means to be virtuous is being at least increasing my understanding why that is worthwhile, or how I should balance different requirements. Because my worry is that otherwise, for example, religions teach you to be generous, let's say, But if you lack some kind of reasoning behind, for example, when generosity and some other virtuous requirement collide, then you're left without guidance, because there can't be a specific rule to solve all possible conflicts, for example, among virtues. So if you're not at least preliminarily or initially or at some degree wise, I wouldn't see how you can manage to survive conflict, for example.
Well, you might not, but what I'm saying is you can still be, virtuous or or moral. It doesn't mean that you are not moral. Therefore, you just now have this dilemma.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like we're going to get to the full agreement on this point. I'd like to move on to Christian Miller. Sorry, Monica, but
no problem.
I'd like to give him a chance to interact with Maria Silvia. He's been very patient there. So go ahead, Christian.
Great. Well, first of all, super presentation. As always, just a huge fan of your work. And I think we agree on so much more than we disagree here. So just a tiny point and then a larger point. The tiny point is that on one slide, you said practical wisdom is a normative rather than descriptive concept. And I wonder why you wanted to say rather than. Why not just say both? Seems to me it's a thick normative concept. It has both normative and descriptive components to it. But that's a real tiny thing. The larger point is just how far apart are we really? So you hold what I call the Socratic model. That's my label. I think it's a fair label. And I hold this eliminativist position. And we both are kind of unified in criticizing the standard approach. So the kind of standard Aristotelian approach, we both have plenty of objections to raise against that. That was really my main target, was the standard Aristotelian approach. So if I kind of knock that down, I'm feeling pretty good about what I was doing in that paper, even if I haven't knocked down all the other alternatives like the Socratic approach. That's okay. So, but when suppose we do knock that Aristotelian approach down, so we have your Socratic model and we have my eliminativism. Well, where are they? What's the disagreements remaining between us? What really sets them apart? What distinguishes them? It seems to me that what distinguishes them is metaphysical at this point. So you're contrary to what Veronica said, who I actually thought was on my side, and maybe Monica too, but definitely what Veronica said. So you're committed to the existence of a trait called practical wisdom. So metaphysically, you're committed to there being, in addition to all these capacities that you outlined, on top of that, a trait which exists and has causal features and explanatory roles to play and so forth, and that is the trait of practical wisdom. And so, on my view, on the other hand, I'm a eliminativist, so I just say there is no such trait. I deny the existence of this trait of practical wisdom. I'm fine with just operating at the level of all these more specific capacities, all the ones, even I'll just go with what you said, all the ones you talked about: self-regulative, self-cultivation, reflection on the value of ends, motivating affective response, deliberative ability, intuitive ability, and so forth. I'm fine. Let's just grant all those. But to me, I don't want to add on top of that an additional something else, namely the trait of practical wisdom. And your view, I think, has to say that it's committed metaphysically to there being this distinct trait of practical wisdom. So I think actually Veronica's, when she was talking about it's not a trait, it's a package. That's actually my eliminativist view, and that's not your Socratic view. So at first, I guess here's the question: is that a right way to understand the difference between our positions? Is that correct? And secondly, what's to be gained by adding the existence of this trait?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Well, I'll answer very quickly the first one. Yes, when I realized that I've put rather than in the slide. I thought, why? No, I didn't want to mean that it's normative rather than, but it's normative and descriptive. So totally agree, that was my bad. But coming to the second very important question, yeah, I have to confess that yesterday I was discussing the contents of this presentation with my 3 of my colleagues, and at some point we realized what you say, that our positions differ only insofar as they draw a kind of metaphysically opposed conclusion. And we realized that we need to work on the metaphysics of this. So what's the metaphysical status, let's say the ontology, the ontological status we want to assign to this package concept? Or you seem to imply that we are committed to claiming that it's a trait because it has a causal role or explanatory role. I'm maybe not so sure about that, but I'm sure that we need to work on the metaphysics underlying this stuff. So yes, thanks for that. It's a good, very good reconstruction of what we disagree upon. So good that we came to the same conclusion yesterday. And so we agree on what we disagree about and also what we agree upon. And yes, definitely we need to work out our metaphysics better than that. Thanks.
If I could just follow up real quickly. Yeah, I think that's great. And then so it's working out the metaphysics, and then there's also arguments for why we need to posit such a thing. So at least my view has the advantage of parsimony here, that it's one less thing we need to posit in our mental ontology. So if we're going to have to posit something extra, it needs to do some work that can't be done by the base level abilities.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, but that's all great. I mean, I love. I look forward to seeing that down the road. And I mean, I'm not wedded to eliminativism at the end of the day, so maybe I'll come over to your view.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks for that. We're certainly grappling with difficult questions here. Yeah. Could we move on to Kristjánsson? He was also mentioned frequently today, and it'd be nice to let him have a role in the discussion too.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn, and thanks, Maria. It's always nice listening to you. Sorry, I'm traveling. I don't have access to any video camera at the moment, so I'll just be speaking from the dark. Well, I actually completely agree with Christian Miller. I think what unites you is much more important than what separates you. I mean, I think you are both, in a way, eliminatists with respect to the Aristotelian concept of phronesis. So I just want to remind colleagues of how radical your departure from Aristotle is. I mean, I could give a long list, but just to mention 2 very quick things. I mean, Aristotle speaks a lot about phronesis, not only in Nicomachean ethics, but also in the politics, in the context of the civic virtues. And there he says that you can have full civic virtue without any phronesis. So he does think that rulers of states need phronesis to be civically virtuous, but not ordinary people. They can be fully virtuous civically without phronesis. Now you might want to say, well, I'm not talking about phronesis in the context of the civic virtues, only the ethical virtues. But then again, in the Nicomachean ethics, Aristotle thinks that most people obviously don't possess any phronesis, but even those who are virtuous, most of them don't have phronesis either. They've just got habituated virtues. And even children, and he talks about children being courageous in the rhetoric. So obviously, by definition, they don't have any phronesis. But a child who acts courageously is acting from the motivation of courage, is exhibiting courage. The child is going to get into serious trouble when courage meets with other virtues, because the child doesn't have phronesis to see and synthesize the two. But for Aristotle, you can be fully virtuous in the habituated sense without any phronesis. So I'm just making the point that you're obviously departing very far away from Aristotle. Now that may not be a problem, but I just wonder why frame your thesis as being there to rescue a phronesis concept? Why not simply say, well, I think phronesis is redundant, but I have another concept. This is very important. This is the concept of ethical expertise, and I want to define and defend that. So I see very little of the Aristotelian concept left in what you are saying. So it may not be a problem, but I'm just wondering why you frame your thesis in the way you do.
Okay, thanks, Christian, for great questions as usual. Yeah, you spotted kind of an issue. I realize this is unorthodox. I would love to think that it's a way not to dismiss the Aristotelian concept of phronesis, but to, let's say, I don't want to use the word upgrade, but let's revise it without dismissing it or shifting framework, let's say. Maybe because I'm biased and I've been raised within an Aristotelian framework, so I don't want to admit that I'm betraying the original Aristotelian inspiration I had. Maybe this is the reason why. Yeah, what I want to point out is that yes, there may be little of the Aristotelian phronesis in our ethical expertise. The point would be that we would like to translate the whole picture of phronesis plus the ethical virtues in the expertise concept we are using. So I'm aware that our ethical expertise is not the exact translation of the Aristotelian phronesis. It adds motivational, for example, and other features that wouldn't be maybe traditionally ascribed to practical wisdom by Aristotle, for example. I'm not even sure that all the 7 functions identified by Christian Miller would be acknowledged by Aristotle himself as pertaining to practical wisdom in its original version. So I'm not sure. Yeah, it may be true, yes, that maybe we want to be Aristotelians, but we are not so Aristotelian anymore. But still, yeah, I'd like to point out that it's the Aristotelian whole picture rather than the Aristotelian single concept of phronesis that we are trying to translate into the ethical expertise paradigm. So yeah, which makes us even more un-Aristotelian, maybe, but still, yeah. For me.
Thanks, I'm okay with that. We'll continue the discussion somewhere else, I'm sure.
Yeah. We'll meet in Birmingham in a while, so we can.
Thanks for that, Christian. It's nice to have you here, even if you're speaking from the dark. We have a few more minutes left, and Dean has his hand up as well.
Blaine, thank you. And my apologies to the group. Though I am very old of age, I'm rather a youngster in this conversation. So, and I missed part of it when I lost my cell phone coverage of the presentation and moved into finally found my laptop and was able to get back online. So there was a part of the conversation, though, that's reminiscent for me within a different field, which is around the field of consciousness, particularly in the field of science. And so this is really a question more than anything else. I didn't know how often perhaps the concept of emergence might have been used as a part of understanding practical wisdom. When I hear the language of package versus trait, for instance, particularly around the language of consciousness, there is this idea of an emergent property. And it struck me, Maria, in your presentation, when you began talking about complexity, that, perhaps one way to think about phronesis would be more out of this idea of emergence, a kind of property that emerges out of the complexity of either dealing with the multiple functions or just within the task, if you will, of what goes on in moral decision making. So it's just a different way of trying to think about it. And the philosopher I have in mind is Philip Schrag, who really kind of resists this idea of universal versus reductionism, but talks about transversal, which is really a way of talking about ongoing complexity rather than ever reaching a sort of a metaphysical framework of the universal. So it would be a way of asking, could this be a kind of transversal emergent trait or property that we now think of as a trait? And would that be a different way of understanding this that does give it some kind of ontic presence without it having to be fully metaphysical in its framework? It's a kind of question to raise to move forward. And then I'll get out and listen to the people that actually know the field much better than I.
Well, thanks so much for the question, which points again to the fact that here part of the work that needs to be done is metaphysical in nature. Yeah, I like the idea of the emergent property. I'm not sure it can fit the picture we have in mind, but I kind of think it could. And I think this is the right direction to work on the metaphysics of this again. So I think something like this could be the right way of accounting for this package, but still, which is not simply under the umbrella term of practical wisdom, but so to retain a trait which has something of a trait, so the metaphysical status of something in itself and not simply the sum of different functions to which we give a single label for the sake of as a shortcut, let's say. And this could be a way to account for its metaphysical status. So thanks, and my answer would be I need to work more on this, but this is the work to be done now together with other work on refining the account of expertise. This is you've made me realize that this is the point where we need to work more. So thank you for great questions and discussion.
There's a little bit of time left here, so I'm going to jump in, and I may or may not have another bit of work for you to do. But one of the things that I like most about the Aristotelian approach is that, to me, the love of the good is what's at the center. And it's that love that motivates us and moves us toward what's valuable. And so I just had the sneaking feeling, and I could be wrong about this, and correct me if I am, is that motivation just seems a little tacked on to this recognition prime decision model and ethical expertise, because it's easy for me to imagine being an unmotivated expert. In fact, in some ways, I am one. I've been a university professor a long time. I have a lot of expertise in how the university that I work at operates. I'm very unmotivated to use that expertise right now. Now, I won't go into the long and sad story of the decline of my university, but that's very much what I'm seeing. I don't think I've lost any of my knowledge or capacity for administrative things, but I don't have the motivation to use them. So to me, I think you can still be an expert and be demotivated. Whereas as a phronomos, I don't think you can be demotivated, because at the core of that is this love of the good. So that's the way I see it. And I wonder, how do you keep motivation central in your model? Keep it like a big part of it rather than as a tack on.
Yeah. Thanks, Blaine. That's probably the most challenging criticism to wisdom as a skill, together with the domain. But I think this is the motivational issue is the central one. Well, that's precisely what the model by Swartwood and Tiberius tries to do, to reconcile the idea that there's some skills where motivation is essential to being skillful, not just to act on your skillfulness, but to be skillful, which would mean that it's not really as if I could stop being motivated without also stopping being expert in that field somehow. A way would be to conceive of a double, let's say, like an additional motivation. For example, in order to be wise, you need moral skillfulness plus what Schwartz and Sharp called moral will. Let's say you have moral skill plus moral will, as if were to like an added motivational force to something you're skilled at. I think there's some cases where you can see that one is good at what it does, insofar as he's also motivated to do that. I'm thinking of the surgeon, for example. I mean, I wouldn't call a great surgeon someone who's not motivated to be a good surgeon anymore, because this lack of motivation would appear or result in something she doesn't do well anymore, for example, or in a lack of engagement with her job, which implies that she is not a very skillful surgeon anymore. And I'd say the same thing about the teacher. By doing so, I don't want to offend you and claim that you're not an expertician anymore, but maybe you're not motivated to do the bureaucracy. But I'm not sure your expertise in being a good teacher, for example, has it at central that you're great at doing bureaucracy. So, I mean, maybe your example was construed in a way that forced the conclusion that you can be expert without being motivated, but you're not motivated, not in a very narrow sense, you're not motivated to engage with that administrative stuff anymore, for example, but which I'm not sure is part of what the core of an expert teacher consists of. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, thank you for being kind.
No,
I was really referring to the bureaucratic side or the administrative side. I do see it as two very different kinds of expertise, because I have fabulous teaching colleagues who don't know the first thing about how the university works, and vice versa. People who are wonderful administration, they couldn't teach to save their lives. So I think they are quite separate. And in my terms, what I would say is what's changed for me is I don't love my university anymore. I used to,
I see.
But it changed so much that I can't love it the way it is. I love the way it used to be. But in any case, what you're saying is that what you mean by expertise includes this moral will. And so my example then becomes a bit of a challenge to that inclusion. But, you know, it's one of those things that I'm critical of many approaches to wisdom, because I think they're undermotivated, and they don't include affect enough. And not just specific affects, but just a general affective tone, and that one is really fully engaged as a person, not just as a brain. I don't think you fall into that camp, but I still have the same bit of a worry about that.
Yeah.
Well, let me bring us to a close. We'll show a little mercy to Maria Silvia. Do not keep her on the hot seat forever. But I really appreciate the talk and the food for thought you provided for us. I think it's great. It got us right into some really central and prominent issues with regard to phronesis and flourishing, which I think is where we want to be. So I really thank you for that. And I also want to just again say how wonderful it is to be in even a virtual room with this group of people. I mean, you're really amazing people. And so thank you so much for being a part of this and being interested and coming today and contributing and questioning and so forth, listening. This is just a great group, and I'm very, very humble about being a part of it. So I so appreciate you. So next week, Matt Stichter is going to talk to us some more about his version of virtues as skills, which I think will be fun. And then on the 31st, Tobias Kretnauer is going to talk to us about moral identity, which is a big topic. And I think one that I think we get to also sink our teeth into really nicely. So I'm really looking forward to those two talks as well. Thank you so much. Have a great week.
Thank you everybody
Thanks,
for the
everyone.
great Q&A and for having me. Bye.